Beneath the ordinary hum of traffic and the glow of streetlights, whole worlds are sleeping. Cities older than memory, compressed like pages in a book. Think of London. The modern financial towers rise where Roman Londinium once bustled, a city founded soon after the Claudian invasion in the mid-1st century AD. Long before Rome or London, people clustered beside rivers and springs, building permanence from mud and reed. Uruk, in southern Mesopotamia, swelled into one of the world's first true cities during the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. Çatalhöyük, on the Anatolian plain, grew as a densely packed community as early as 7500 BCE. Jericho's walls and hearths reach back into the 10th millennium BCE, each a foundation for later urban life. Some buried layers are the result of time and habit, generations building on the old, forming the archaeological tells that mark long occupation. Others are the consequence of conquest. When the Spaniards razed Tenochtitlan in 1521, they built a new capital directly atop its ruins. Today, Mexico City still sits on that island grid, and the stones of the great Templo Mayor lie beneath the plaza. These are not myths of hidden treasure or fantastical cities. They are the slow, material facts of human life. Mudbrick turned to rubble, temples covered by marketplaces, streets realigned over forgotten foundations. Archaeology, sometimes sparked by a subway tunnel or a construction pit, peels back those layers and forces us to rethink the ground we take for granted. If this idea awakens your curiosity, join us on a calm excavation through time. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell, and together we'll walk the streets that hide entire ancient worlds, listening for the stories the earth still remembers.
The story of cities begins not with marble or columns, but with a single stubborn choice: to stay. For tens of thousands of years, human groups moved with herds, chased seasonal growth, and carried only what they needed. Then, slowly, sometimes suddenly, people planted seeds where they stood. Those first decisions to settle, to grow, and to store surplus set in motion a chain of changes that would create the very idea of urban life. Look first to places of water. Jericho, beside a perennial spring in the Jordan Valley, preserves layers of occupation that push back to the 10th millennium BCE. There, communities in the pre-pottery Neolithic gathered around reliable water and began to tend wild cereals and pulse crops. They constructed substantial stone walls and towers, one of the earliest known monumental architectures, evidence that living in place required new forms of organization and collective labor. Those walls were not only defense, they were a sign that people saw value in staying put and protecting what they had built. On the Anatolian plateau, Çatalhöyük offers a different but equally telling picture. From roughly 7400 to 6200 BCE, its densely packed houses formed a continuous honeycomb without streets. People entered homes through the roof and painted their walls with vivid scenes of hunt and ritual. There were no palaces or overt rulers, yet complex social life thrived. Shared art, craft specialization, and long-distance exchange for obsidian and exotic goods. Çatalhöyük shows that urban-like density and symbolic culture can emerge from repeated, intimate acts of community life long before kings and written laws. The defining shift from village to city, what scholars have called the urban revolution, did not happen overnight nor in isolation. V. Gordon Childe first described a cluster of changes: surplus-producing agriculture, craft specialization, social hierarchy, the rise of trade networks, and the development of administrative systems. In river valleys where irrigation multiplied yields, populations concentrated, public architecture appeared, and the material complexity of life grew beyond the scale small groups could manage alone. These factors combined to produce cities as new kinds of political and economic organisms. Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, crystallizes these transformations. By the late 4th millennium BCE, settlements like Uruk swelled into real urban centers, monumental temples, specialized craftsmen, marketplaces, and a bureaucracy recording transactions. The need to manage grain rations, labor obligations, and temple storerooms drove innovations in record-keeping. Tokens, pictographs, and then proto-cuneiform signs appeared, tools meant to make a complex city legible and governable. The earliest writing, in effect, was bookkeeping for the city. Population density changed material life. Storage pits and granaries appeared alongside homes. Pottery and metallurgy developed to support new economic roles. Specialized workshops clustered near marketplaces. Cities required labor organization not simply for production, but for maintenance. Roads, irrigation canals, defensive works. That meant leaders, councils, priests, or administrators who could coordinate large projects and adjudicate disputes. Over generations, the built environment itself recorded these layers of social complexity. Note how geography shaped possibilities. In the Fertile Crescent, predictable river floods and rich alluvial soils allowed surplus agriculture. On the Anatolian plateau, proximity to mineral sources like obsidian fueled early craft networks. In the Levant, crossroads of caravan routes made some settlements into hubs of exchange. Each early city formed as a solution to local constraints and opportunities. Yet the broad pattern repeats. Where humans could reliably feed more mouths than they raised, urban structures followed.
Material evidence anchors these claims. Archaeologists read layers, strata of packed earth, reused foundations, midden deposits, to reconstruct life at these early sites. The tell, an artificial mound created by centuries of construction atop earlier habitation, becomes the city's vertical memory. Each layer contains pottery shards, animal bones, hearths, and post holes, fragments that, when assembled, reveal changes in diet, social structure, and technology. Tells are not poetic metaphors, they are physical archives of human decisions piled one upon another. With the growth of cities came new social distinctions. Some households accumulated surplus and power, others specialized in crafts or administration. Temples and palaces emerged as focal points, religious, economic, and political nodes where resources flowed and decisions were made. In southern Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose as platforms for temples. In Egypt, large state projects like the early monarchy's monumental architecture organized labor at scale. These institutions anchored the city and signaled the emergence of elite classes. Yet urban birth was uneven. Some settlements remained small, others ballooned. Environmental stress, trade disruptions, or warfare could stall or reverse urban growth. Cities were dynamic experiments, sometimes durable, sometimes fragile. The archaeological record shows cycles of construction and neglect, rebuilding after floods or fires, and cultural blending as peoples moved, traded, and conquered. The very act of building above older foundations began the long game of accumulation that buries earlier phases under later ones. Importantly, cities changed how people imagined the world. Shared temples, public archives, and monumental art embedded a common narrative about ancestors, gods, and rulers that bound residents together. Administrative records, whether proto-writing clay tags or later cuneiform tablets, made collective obligations legible. Who owed labor? Who received rations? Which fields were irrigated and when? Record-keeping was not neutral. It created new forms of authority and memory, and in doing so, produced the social conditions for long-term urban life. Consider trade and connectivity. Early cities never existed in isolation. They were nodes in regional networks. Obsidian from central Anatolia appears in Levantine sites. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan traveled to Mesopotamia. Timber, grain, and metals
flowed along rivers and across deserts. These connections amplified specialization. If a city could import wood, it could focus on textiles. If it controlled a copper source, metallurgy could become central. In this way, urban economies reinforced each other and encouraged regional complexity. Demography and inequality followed. As some households gained control of production or religious offices, social hierarchies hardened. Burial practices, house sizes, and wealth objects revealed widening differences. Elites with access to prestige goods, commoners producing bulk staples, and specialists whose skill set gave them standing. Cities created the conditions for collective achievements, but also for concentrated power and eventually for organized conflict over resources. Technology, too, evolved to meet urban demands. Wheel-thrown pottery, bronze tools, and architectural innovations made larger constructions possible and more efficient. The administrative impulse produced writing systems, initially pictographic tokens and labels designed to track economic flows. That first inkless writing, impressed with a stylus on clay, would be the hinge between prehistory and recorded history, turning ephemeral actions into an archival record that future generations could read. The earliest cities were not perfect blueprints for later metropolises. They were contingent solutions, assembled piecemeal by people responding to immediate needs: food security, defense, ritual order, and exchange. But their cumulative effect was profound. Once human communities practiced sustained, concentrated settlement over centuries, they created the conditions for institutions that could persist beyond individual lifetimes. Kingships, religious hierarchies, legal codes, and written archives. Those institutions, in turn, produced the layered landscapes archaeologists encounter when they peel back the soil of our modern cities. In the next sections, we will follow how these first foundations, built of mudbrick, reed, and bone, accumulated into empires and palimpsests. For now, feel the simple logic that underpins urban life. Stay, farm, store, trade, record. Each act left a trace, and those traces, stacked through millennia, are the foundations in the dust upon which every later city has been built. If you're intrigued by how a shard of pottery or a storage jar can rewrite our understanding of civilization, we'll move slowly and follow those fragments. Like and subscribe to keep walking with us through the strata of time. There is more to unearth, and every layer tells a part of the human story.
Cities are time machines built upward. Each generation erects, adapts, or tears down what came before. And in that process, the ground itself becomes a ledger of conquest, care, neglect, and invention. We can read a city's biography in its layers, a palimpsest of fallen walls, recycled stones, and new street lines that betray older alignments. This cycle of destruction and rebirth is not poetic metaphor. It is the material fact of urban life. Consider Mesopotamia, where the tension between continuity and rupture is visible in successive capitals. Sumerian city-states like Ur and Eridu founded civic life on temple economies and irrigation. Later, Babylon rose to prominence under Amorite rulers, and in the 18th century BCE, under Hammurabi's codification of law and administration, the city became the center of a new political order. The new power did not erase the old so much as build over it. New palaces and temples on older foundations, a civic strategy repeated across antiquity. That pattern appears in the Mediterranean as well. The Etruscans and other Italic peoples shaped central Italy before Rome's expansion. As Rome consolidated control, it reused Etruscan infrastructure and absorbed local elites, folding earlier cultures into new administrative systems. Over centuries, Roman Republic and then Empire remade cityscapes with forums, aqueducts, and roads, while later medieval builders scavenged classical stone, creating layers of repurposed material across the urban fabric. The city was not static, it was continuously recomposed. The practice of reuse, spolia,
offers a striking visual of this cycle. Columns, capitals, and carved stones were taken from older structures and inserted into new walls and churches. In Constantinople's great monuments and in medieval Rome's basilicas, fragments from ancient temples were rearranged not just for economy, but to create political and aesthetic messages, to show continuity with a glorious past, to display conquest, or simply to supply building materials in times when quarrying anew was costly or dangerous. Spolia is the urban language of succession. It tells us who claimed prestige and who adapted to scarcity. Empires often reverse the orientation of cities. Victors impose new grids, reorient sacred precincts, or deliberately level temples to assert a different order. After 330 CE, Constantine consecrated a new Rome on the older Greek settlement of Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople and transforming it into the imperial heart of the Eastern Mediterranean. The city's monuments and walls testify to layers of Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Latin, and Ottoman presence, each superimposed upon what came before. The political act of refounding a city is also an act of rewriting its landscape.
Not all breaks come from rulers alone. Catastrophe, whether volcanic fire, flood, or siege, can create abrupt stratigraphy. When Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, Pompeii and Herculaneum were buried under meters of ash and pumice. Those layers preserved a moment in time, but they also interrupted urban continuity, producing a spectacular archaeological snapshot while altering long-term occupation patterns. Later still, small communities returned to live among the ruins, reusing structures in new ways. The city's afterlives complicate the idea of one single, neat ending. Across the Atlantic, the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan in 1521 provides one of the clearest examples of conscious urban replacement. The conquistadors razed much of the Aztec ceremonial center and piled stones from temples into the foundations of a new colonial city. Mexico City's cathedral and colonial grid overlay the island city's original causeways and canals. Centuries later, the discovery of the Templo Mayor and associated artifacts revealed how deeply the Spanish settlement had been built upon an Aztec metropolis. In this case, the new order literally sat on the bones and stones of the old. The reasons for rebuilding on top of older cities are pragmatic as often as symbolic. Location matters. Access to water, defensible positions, established roads or trade routes makes a spot valuable across generations. Why move when the site's advantages persist? Instead, later builders adapt. They alter foundations, raise street levels to cope with flooding, or level damaged quarters to erect new fortifications. Over centuries, those practical adjustments accrete into the mounded forms archaeologists recognize as tells. Urban layers also encode changing values. A temple's stones may be reused to build a fortress, signaling a shift from sacred to strategic priorities. A palace may be replaced by housing blocks as elite families decline. Material culture, pottery styles, architectural orders, the range of imported goods records those shifts. Archaeologists read this evidence as a change in social structure. Who has power, what resources are prized, and which external connections matter at a given moment. Those changes are not always gentle transitions. They can be the aftermath of conquest, religious reform, or economic collapse. Look closely at the archaeological record, and you find surprising forms of continuity within rupture. Roman roads often continued to guide medieval street plans. Marketplaces remained near favorable intersections. Sacred precincts sometimes preserved their sanctity beneath new cults. In Jerusalem, for example, layers accumulate to exceed millennia. Bronze Age foundations, Herodian walls, Byzantine churches, Crusader fortifications, Ottoman repairs, each era using older structures while re-signifying them. The city's multiple palimpsests testify to how urban meaning is constantly renegotiated. The vertical nature of cities means that destruction can be both erasure and preservation. When stones are toppled and buildings collapse, pieces of the past may be buried and thus shielded from later weathering, sometimes preserving frescoes, inscriptions, and organic materials that otherwise decay. Catastrophic burial, as at Pompeii, can freeze a culture's material world. Conversely, deliberate demolition followed by rebuilding tends to scatter and repurpose material, integrating fragments of the past into new narratives. Both outcomes complicate how we reconstruct history. Power and memory intersect in how cities are rebuilt. Authorities have long used urban planning to assert legitimacy. Augustus refashioned Rome's public buildings. Caliphs and Byzantine emperors commissioned grand mosques and churches. Colonial administrators imposed grids and plazas to project order. These projects were both practical governance and public statements, a way to write a new chapter atop an older one. But the material remains of the older chapter never quite vanish. They reappear in foundations, in reused capitals, in the crooked alignment of a street. Spolia and stratigraphy function as countervoices to official narratives, reminding us of the layered nature of claims to authority. Archaeology, then, becomes a political act of listening to those countervoices. Excavators must untangle complex sequences. Which wall belonged to which era? Which deposit belongs to a market season and which to a catastrophic event? Stratigraphic methods, reading layer after layer with careful dating and contextual analysis, let us reconstruct episodes of urban transformation. Radiocarbon dates, pottery typologies, coin finds, and inscriptions work together to provide the temporal anchors that make sense of what at first appears as an unencipherable mound. Modern urban growth intensifies these tensions. Construction projects, subways, high-rises, sewage upgrades routinely uncover earlier phases of city life. Sometimes this leads to preservation, sometimes to rapid rescue archaeology that documents remains before they are removed. The practical demands of a living city often clash with the slow methods of archaeology. Still, these clashes produce some of our richest discoveries. Ancient walls revealed in metro stations, mosaics removed and conserved for museums, skeletal remains that refocus our understanding of health, diet, and violence in past populations. Urban archaeology is thus both an act of discovery and an exercise in negotiation. The cycle of destruction and rebirth also shapes cultural identity. In places where rulers deliberately erased the monuments of previous regimes, later generations sometimes dug those monuments up to reclaim a past. In other cases, forgetting was part of survival. Communities adapted to new orders by blending practices. That blending, acculturation, syncretism, the reuse of symbols, often leaves subtle traces. Hybrid pottery shapes, reused inscriptions with new dedications, or the integration of older sacred sites into new ritual topographies. These are the fingerprints of how societies negotiate continuity amid rupture. The lesson of layered cities is ethical as well as intellectual. When we build today, our choices will be the strata of tomorrow. Urban renewal that values speed over memory risks erasing voices we have barely begun to hear. But the past also offers models of adaptation, reuse of materials, the pragmatic reconfiguration of space, and a recognition that urban sites accrue meaning through successive communities. To walk a modern street is to walk over decisions made centuries ago, choices about where to settle, who to honor, how to dispose of the dead, and how to make a living. Each layer is an argument, and together they compose the long, often messy essay that is a city.
Rome is a city that writes its history into stone and then, with equal force, buries it again, folding 1,000 years of lives into the compact strata under its streets. The Palatine, the Forum, The Appian Hill and the narrow alleys around them are not just picturesque ruins. They form a vertical biography, where Bronze Age huts sit beneath Republican basilicas, where emperors built lavish palaces that later generations tunneled into, and where a Roman sewer like the Cloaca Maxima still runs beneath modern foundations. The story begins at the Palatine, Rome's origin stage. Archaeology shows human presence there from as early as the 10th century BCE, long before the legendary founding of 753 BCE, with simple huts and burial features that point to a community organized around kin groups and localized ritual practice. These earliest habitations laid the first platform of Roman continuity. Later kings and aristocrats built atop the hill, converting modest dwellings into the seats of power that would grow into an imperial city. Move down into the valley, and the Forum reveals itself as a palimpsest, a civic center that accumulated plans, monuments, and administrative layers across centuries. What looks like scattered columns and broken pavements is actually strata of political life: republican assemblies, imperial fora, triumphal arches, and market stalls stacked one upon another. Excavations over the last 2 centuries have revealed that beneath medieval deposits and Renaissance gardens lie the oblong spaces where Romans debated, traded, and legislated for a millennium. Emperors often reshaped the city by imposing grand architectural programs, but those programs frequently depended on the substructure left by earlier builders. Nero's Domus Aurea, the Golden House, constructed after the Great Fire of 64 CE, is a dramatic example. Vast and opulent, it sprawled across the Appian Hill with artificial lakes, frescoed rooms, and even a rotating dining room described by ancient sources. After Nero's death, the Flavian emperors partially dismantled and covered it, turning parts into the baths of Trajan and leaving others hidden until Renaissance artists and later archaeologists began to rediscover and strip away its layers. That rediscovery explains part of Rome's double life. During the 15th and 16th centuries, artists like Raphael and Michelangelo tunneled into Neronian rooms, studying grotesque frescoes and vaults that influenced Renaissance decoration. Those early explorations were not careful archaeological digs by modern standards. They were curious intrusions that mixed artistic reverence with opportunistic access. Yet they also reopened a dialogue between past and present, making the buried Domus Aurea part of Rome's living cultural imagination long before formal excavations protected it. Rome's subterranean continuity is also functional. The Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's oldest engineered sewers, began as an open drainage channel in the 6th century BCE and was later vaulted in stone. It drained marshes and carried wastewater to the Tiber, shaping where people could build and which areas remained habitable. The sewer's enduring presence shows how Roman engineering choices created durable subterranean infrastructure, literally anchoring the modern city to ancient hydraulics and urban planning decisions. But imperial grandeur and engineering coexisted with everyday recycling and reuse. Rome's builders reused earlier stones, reworked old foundations, and adapted street plans to new needs. The phenomenon of spolia, salvaged architectural fragments repurposed in later structures, is everywhere. Columns carved for pagan temples became pilasters in medieval churches. Marble slabs from imperial porticos served as steps for medieval houses. Those reused stones are not merely convenience. They are visible testimony to cultural continuity, conquest, and practical thrift. In the 20th century, Rome's buried depths were exposed in a different political key. Benito Mussolini's urban projects, especially the construction of Via dei Fori Imperiali, removed medieval neighborhoods to reveal imperial fora. His regime framed these excavations as a reclamation of Rome's imperial past, literally tearing away later historical layers to showcase ancient monuments. The result was both revelation and loss. Spectacular ancient remains were revealed to the public, but only after the demolition of densely inhabited medieval quarters, displacing communities and erasing centuries of other histories. Excavation practice itself changed over time. Early antiquarians prized recovery of art and inscriptions. 19th century stratigraphic methods matured into systematic archaeology in the 20th century. Modern archaeologists read Forum and surrounding sites with contextual precision. Pottery sequences, coin dates, and carbon samples reveal occupation phases, while careful recording of stratigraphy reconstructs episodes of fire, flood, rebuilding, and abandonment. These scientific methods turned dispersed ruins into an intelligible biography of Roman urban life.
The interplay of preservation and destruction also produces surprising finds. In the cramped block of Largo di Torre Argentina, 4 Republican temples and the remains associated with Julius Caesar's assassination were uncovered in the early 20th century, revealing how layers of sacred space sat directly beneath later buildings and even an 18th century theater. The site has since become famous both for its archaeological significance and for the cat sanctuary that now inhabits its corners, another example of how modern civic life coexists with ancient ruins in everyday Roman experience. The verticality of Rome complicates any simple narrative of rise and fall. Destruction could preserve. Volcanic ash, collapsing roofs, or intentional infill sometimes sealed frescoes, wooden beams, and organic materials that would otherwise have rotted away. At the same time, rebuilding fragmented the archaeological record, scattering objects and mixing materials from different times. Archaeologists must therefore balance optimism and humility when reconstructing Rome's past, assembling a story from fragments that the city itself rearranged in life and death. Consider also the human scale of these layers. Everyday Roman life, bakeries, latrines, taberne, and street vendors left material traces as telling as monumental architecture. A bakery's oven, rubbish pits, and butchered animal bones speak to diet, economy, and social organization in ways that palaces cannot. When metro or sewer works uncover such features, they offer grounded insights into how millions of ordinary Romans fed, worked, and worshipped within the shadow of emperors. These domestic residues, preserved under centuries of rebuildings, make Rome's past palpably ordinary and familiar. The city's hidden depths are not only archaeological, they are also political and ethical questions. Who decides what gets unearthed? Which layers are valued and which are sacrificed for modern development? The history of excavations in Rome exposes shifting priorities. Renaissance artists sought inspiration, Enlightenment collectors sought artifacts, fascist planners sought symbolic capital, and contemporary archaeologists insist on contextual preservation. Each approach reflects different conceptions of the past and different distributions of cultural authority. Conservation adds another layer of complexity. Exposed frescoes and vaults are vulnerable to water, pollution, and the constant movement of a living city. The recent, carefully managed reopening of sections of the Domus Aurea illustrates the painstaking work required to stabilize buried structures, controlling humidity, shoring up fragile vaults, and using modern materials sympathetically so that the public can visit without destroying what remains. Preservation is an ongoing negotiation between public access and scientific caution. Yet, for all the scientific method and political theater, Rome continues to surprise. Construction and maintenance uncover new data every decade. A previously unknown foundation, a cache of coins, a graffiti that redates an inscription. The city is an active archive, its ground yields fresh evidence that can revise long-standing interpretations of chronology, economy, and urban planning. That capacity for revision is central to the humanistic value of archaeology. Facts change as new layers reveal themselves. Walking modern Rome, one senses the stratified argument beneath the pavement. The Colosseum's shadow falls across medieval alleys. Cafe tables sit where senators once debated. A tram line crosses what was once the Forum Marsh, drained by the Cloaca Maxima. These juxtapositions are not anachronistic stunts. They are the city's honest condition. Rome's continuity rests on adaptation, on reuse, reinvention, and the pragmatic impulse to build where conditions favor life. Each layer, whether palace or potter's kiln, contributes to a continuous urban narrative. Rome teaches a broader human lesson. Cities keep memory not in tidy museums, but in messy substrata. Power rearranges space. Disasters bury moments, and everyday people reuse materials to meet needs. Our challenge is to listen to those archaeological sediments without imposing teleological stories of inevitable decline or glorious ascent. The ground under Rome is a careful mediator of history, stubbornly material, insistently present, and always capable of surprising us with a fragment that rewrites an assumption. Soon we will leave Rome and trace similar vertical lives in other great cities. Athens, a city of sanctuaries and subway surprises. Mexico City, where a colonial metropolis covers an Aztec capital. Istanbul, where Byzantium and Constantinople persist under Ottoman layers. For now, let the image remain. A cafe chair on modern paving, and only a hand's width below, a tile from an ancient mosaic. A private, enduring connection between the lives of ordinary people across 3,000 years.
Temples are the magnets of memory. They concentrate devotion, wealth, and public ritual in a single site. And because they matter, they attract destruction, reuse, and sometimes deliberate burial. In Athens and Alexandria, the great sanctuaries that once dominated civic life were both stages for political theater and fragile objects of material fate. Their remains, whether lifted from a metro pit or dredged from the sea, are not relics of fantasy. They are forensic evidence of how people in the ancient world understood gods, power, and the city itself. Athens sits like an argument between stone and sky. The Acropolis, crowned by the Parthenon, is the visible icon, but around and beneath it lie centuries of earlier shrines, workshops, graves, and civic installations. The Parthenon itself was erected in the mid-5th century BCE. Construction began in 447 BCE, and major sculptural work completed by 432 BCE, as the culminating monument of Pericles' building program, a marble choir that both celebrated victory in the Persian Wars and housed the city's treasury. That monumental work, however, did not erase the smaller, older votive spaces that had long made the Acropolis a sacred focus. Modern Athens, paradoxically, helped reveal its ancient depth. During the 1990s and early 2000s, the construction of a new metro system required extensive excavations across the city center, at Syntagma, Monastiraki, and Acropolis stations, exposing graves from the Bronze Age, classical house foundations, shop fronts, sections of Roman road, and small sanctuaries. The finds were so abundant that displays were integrated directly into station architecture. Commuters pass ancient stones as they move to trains, a daily reminder that the city's living infrastructure is threaded through ancient ground. These metro excavations transformed public understanding of Athens' continuous occupation and revealed how sacred precincts and domestic life coexisted in layered ways. The smaller, less famous temples and altars tell us as much as the great monuments. The Erechtheion, the Acropolis's complex, asymmetrical shrine with its famous caryatids, preserves evidence of multiple cults,
Athena, Poseidon, and the legendary local heroes. Its uneven ground and carved porches reflect an older topography and sacred geography. Rather than imposing a single symmetrical plan, the Erechtheion accommodates uneven ground and long-standing religious claims. That adaptability underlines a broader truth. Sanctuaries accumulate local traditions, and the architecture often preserves the memory of different religious practices layered on the same spot. Beyond the Acropolis, sanctuaries spilled into neighborhoods. Votive deposits, small altars in courtyards, and neighborhood shrines formed a dense sacred web across the polis. When later Roman or Byzantine projects altered street levels, many of these modest sacred spaces were infilled and effectively sealed, only to be revealed centuries later by the trowel. These buried votive assemblages, terracotta figurines, inscribed dedications, smashed pottery, are not tidy museum pieces. They're records of everyday piety, how ordinary people thanked gods, sought favors, or commemorated vows. These small acts of devotion can survive beneath paving stones for millennia. If Athens demonstrates how continuous urban occupation buries and preserves ritual complexity, Alexandria shows how seismic events and shifting shorelines can consign entire sacred quarters to the sea. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, Alexandria became the Ptolemaic kingdom's crown, a cosmopolitan harbor city of royal palaces, great libraries, and temple complexes. Its harbors, however, were vulnerable. Over centuries, earthquakes, tsunamis, and subsidence, particularly violent events in the 4th century CE and later, altered the coastline and swallowed parts of the city's royal quarter and harbors. Those losses were not accidental erasures. They were geological processes interacting with human settlement. The modern story of Alexandria's submerged temples begins with technology and patient, methodical excavation. Since the late 1990s, the underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio and his team, working with Egyptian authorities and international partners, have mapped and excavated a complex of ruins in Abu Qir Bay, Thonis, Heraklion, Canopus, and parts of the royal quarters of Alexandria itself. Using side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profilers, and careful excavation, teams have revealed colossal statues, granite blocks inscribed with royal titulary, and the foundations of harbors and temples that once hosted ritual processions and royal ceremonies. These discoveries rewrote prior assumptions about Alexandria's coastal topography and the scale of submerged sanctuaries.
Among those finds are monumental blocks and statuary fragments linked to royal cults and temple architecture, the material signals of diplomatic and religious life in a Hellenistic and Romanizing city. The submerged remains include temple platforms, colonnaded quays, and votive offerings jumbled with amphorae and everyday debris, suggesting that the sea's advance was both sudden in places and cumulative in others. The commingling of sacred objects with commercial detritus paints a vivid picture. Temples sat beside harbors where ritual and trade flowed together, and when the sea rose or the ground collapsed, they sank into a mixed archaeological context that challenges neat separation of sacred and secular functions. Popular stories sometimes link these finds to Cleopatra's palace specifically, a romantic phrase that captures imagination. Yet careful archaeology separates evidence from legend. Excavations have uncovered palatial remains in wealthy neighborhoods in the submerged royal quarter, and objects datable to the late Ptolemaic and early Roman periods suggest elite occupation. While some artifact assemblages could plausibly belong to the environs of the Ptolemy's royal architecture, the precise mapping of individual named buildings, the kind of confident attribution seen in novels, requires more textual and archaeological cross-referencing than a single spectacular object can provide. Scientific prudence thus tempers sensational headlines. These underwater sanctuaries also teach methodological lessons.
Marine environments preserve certain materials unusually well. Large stone blocks, inscribed stelae, and bronze statuary can survive where terrestrial contexts might oxidize or be looted. At the same time, organic material is subject to different decay dynamics. Currents can scatter objects millions of meters from their original contexts. Thus, underwater archaeology demands a hybrid toolkit: nautical surveying, conservation science, and contextual analysis to reconstruct the rituals these temples once hosted. The discoveries in Abu Qir Bay are therefore as much a triumph of method as they are of historical curiosity. Returning to Athens, the juxtaposition of civic and sacred functions becomes clearer when we read votive caches and dedicatory inscriptions. Statues that once stood in visible niches might later be toppled and buried with intentionality, to ritually retire a sanctified object, to make room for a new cult, or as the result of iconoclastic conflict. The archaeological signature of those choices, crushed statue fragments in sealed pits, sudden fills above sanctuary floors, let scholars infer episodes of religious contestation and reform. In the classical and Hellenistic periods, religious change could be incremental. In late antiquity, it sometimes became abrupt as imperial policy favored new doctrinal forms. The material record remembers these transitions in stubborn, earthy detail. The material culture of temples, sculpted friezes, painted terracottas, dedicatory inscriptions, and small votive figurines also opens a window into belief systems that were in many ways practical. Offerings often reflect concrete petitions, requests for healing, safe childbirth, or agricultural fertility. The distribution of votive objects across a sanctuary, concentration near an altar, clustering inside niches, records patterns of human need. That is why even tiny terracotta figures unearthed in a metro trench are historically precious. They are the fingerprints of individual worshippers whose names rarely appear in epigraphic records, but whose actions shaped the lived religion of the city. Preservation and public access present recurring ethical choices. In Athens, integrating excavation displays into metro stations allowed broad public engagement, but also raised conservation challenges: how to protect fragile objects in a bustling transport hub. In Alexandria, the decision to excavate submerged royal quarters required international cooperation and meticulous conservation strategies to stabilize stone, desalinate fines, and interpret complex depositional sequences. These practical decisions reflect deeper cultural debates: who owns the past, how should it be displayed, and what responsibilities do modern states have when ancient sanctuaries lie beneath public life or the sea? These buried temples force us to reconsider what it means for a city to be holy. Sanctity was not only an elevated mountaintop or an isolated precinct, it threaded through neighborhoods, harbors, and markets. Whether sealed under a station floor or entombed beneath silt and salt water, sanctuaries preserve human concerns, fear, hope, thanksgiving, that are remarkably like our own. To lift a column or recover a votive cache is to touch an intimate moment across millennia. A person, once alive and anxious and devout, choosing to reach beyond themselves. Archaeology does not just catalog monuments, it reconnects us with that quiet, enduring devotion. When we leave Athens and Alexandria behind, we carry a clear lesson. Temples are both durable and vulnerable, public and private, grand and intimate. They anchor civic identity, and yet they are subject to the same forces that shape every city: politics, geology, economy, and human choice. The remains we uncover are not evidence of vanished worlds in the romantic sense. They are precise, often messy records of how people negotiated divinity within the practical demands of urban life. In those shards and submerged colonnades, the past speaks not in myths, but in material sentences, clear, testable, and profoundly human.
The story of Mexico City is a story of building on the dead and living atop the drowned. Where a vast colonial cathedral and an expansive plaza now stand, once rose the island capital of the Mexica,
Tenochtitlan, founded on an island in Lake Texcoco around 1325 CE. That island city grew into one of the largest and most complex urban centers in the Americas before the Spanish conquest remade the landscape. To imagine Tenochtitlan is to imagine a city engineered from water. The Mexica carved habitable land out of marsh through chinampas, raised fertile plots of soil bound by reeds and willow, and linked islands with broad causeways that cut across the lake. Canals threaded the city like streets, carrying canoes packed with goods, people, and food. Spanish chroniclers compared the city to Venice for its waterways. In truth, it was a distinct, highly ordered metropolis whose market life, administrative structure, and ceremonial core rivaled any Old World capital. At the center of this watery metropolis stood the Templo Mayor, a twin shrine complex dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the war god, and Tlaloc, the rain and fertility god. Its pyramidal platforms were periodically enlarged in successions of construction campaigns, interior spaces filled with offerings, and terraces layered like the rings of a living organism. Each reconstruction did not erase the prior, it built upon it, intentionally burying earlier sacred architecture beneath new stone and ritual deposits. Those successive phases consolidated religious memory literally beneath the feet of the worshippers. The Spanish arrival in the early 16th century upended this world. Hernán Cortés and his band, allied with indigenous enemies of the Mexica, besieged Tenochtitlan in 1521. Prolonged warfare, the disruption of food supplies, and the introduction of Eurasian diseases like smallpox devastated the population, factors that together precipitated the city's fall in August 1521. The Spanish razed and dismantled much of the ceremonial precinct, hauling stones away to build palaces, a cathedral, and the grid of the new colonial capital. The deliberate overlay of a Christian city upon an indigenous capital was both symbolic and practical. The conquerors claimed spiritual and political authority by placing their cathedral over the Mexica temple precinct. The physical consequences of conquest were only part of the transformation. The colonizers began ambitious hydrological projects to control the recurrent flooding of the valley. The lake that gave Tenochtitlan its lifeblood became, in colonial eyes, a hazard to be managed. Over the 17th and 18th centuries, huge drainage works, culminating in the desagüe projects, progressively lowered water levels and boxed in the remaining wetlands. These engineering choices converted the basin from a lacustrine landscape to a largely drained plain, a change that allowed for sprawling urban expansion but also set the stage for long-term environmental strain. But the lake's retreat brought its own problem. The soft, unconsolidated lake sediments compact under heavy loads, and absent the buoyancy of water, the old chinampas and lakebed proved unstable. Mexico City began to subside, a process intensified in the 20th and 21st centuries by deep groundwater extraction. The modern metropolis now sinks unevenly. Central districts founded over the old island platform settle at a different rate than peripheral zones, creating cracked pavements, tilted columns, and complex engineering challenges that are the direct heirs of the ancient wetland environment. In effect, the city built on a lake continues to negotiate that watery memory. The buried ceremonial core did not stay hidden forever. Archaeological rediscovery began tentatively in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but a dramatic accident in 1978 launched systematic excavation. Utility workers turned up a massive stone disk, the Coyalsauqui monolith, depicting the dismembered moon goddess, which proved to be part of the Templo Mayor's ritual complex and indicated the temple's precise location. That find catalyzed the Templo Mayor project, a focused, long-term program of excavation, conservation, and public interpretation carried out by Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, INAH. The Templo Mayor project revealed a ritual corpus remarkable in scale and variety.
Excavations unearthed thousands of offerings, sculpted stone, ceramic effigies, shells from distant coasts, animal remains, turtles, fish, crocodile bones, and richly worked objects in gold and copper. Human remains, often children and young adults associated with sacrificial rites, were found near sacred platforms. These finds demand careful, respectful contextual interpretation, not sensationalism. The assemblage shows that the temple functioned as a focal point for empire-wide exchange and religious practice, drawing tributes and materials from regions as far as Guerrero and the Gulf coasts. Those excavations force a reconsideration of urban continuity. The Zócalo, the vast plaza in front of the cathedral, corresponds roughly to Tenochtitlan's central plaza and marketplace. Many colonial and modern streets trace Aztec causeways or alignments. When archaeologists dig beneath the colonial pavement, they uncover market deposits, domestic layers, and neighborhood shrines, evidence that even after conquest, the physical imprint of the Mexica city persisted. The colonial overlay does not entirely erase the indigenous urban plan. It remade it, sometimes burying it, sometimes integrating it, always altering the dynamics of public life.
The Templo Mayor itself remains a pedagogic touchstone. Its museum and open site expose thousands of objects to the public, but the excavation also raises difficult ethical and political questions. Whose narratives are told at the heart of the nation? How should ritual deposits that include human remains be displayed? INA and Mexican archaeologists have worked to reconcile scientific study with community stakeholders, indigenous perspectives, and national identity, attempting to avoid reducing complex ritual life to colonial clichés or tourist spectacle. The curatorial choices in the museum reflect ongoing debates about commemoration, restitution, and the uses of the past in public life. The ghost of Tenochtitlan is not only archaeological, it lives in memory and national symbolism. The legend of the eagle on a cactus, the founding image of the Mexica, became the emblem on Mexico's national flag. Politicians, artists, and educators draw upon that pre-Hispanic iconography in constructing narratives of national identity. Commemorations of indigenous persistence and colonial violence often converge at the Zócalo, where modern civic ritual overlays ancient ritual geography, making the plaza a multi-layered stage for historical remembrance and contemporary politics. Contemporary fieldwork at Templo Mayor continues to refine and complicate earlier narratives. Recent projects have recovered offerings that reveal expanded networks of exchange and ritual practice, including objects stylistically linked to regions outside the Valley of Mexico. These finds underline the Mexica Empire's reach and its capacity to incorporate material culture from diverse provinces into metropolitan ritual life. New radiocarbon dates and stratigraphic analyses also fine-tune chronologies, showing episodic phases of expansion and renovation in line with political changes and dynastic ambitions. Archaeology here remains an active conversation rather than a closed book. To understand conquest in human terms, look at the built environment. The Spanish constructed a dramatic new skyline, churches, government houses, and grid streets that flattened the visual dominance of the indigenous temples. But they also inadvertently preserved much, not by design, but by the logic of reuse. Stones from the Templo Mayor and other sacred precincts were quarried for colonial monuments. In the act of dismantling the temple, colonizers preserved fragments that would later inform archaeological interpretation. The colonial city's masonry thus contains ironies, material evidence of violent reconfiguration that also became the raw data of recovery centuries later. The environmental legacy of building on a lake has modern consequences. Mexico City's seasonal flooding and long-term subsidence demand continuous engineering responses, levees, pumping systems, and modern drainage works. Urban planners today contend with groundwater depletion, earthquake risk amplified by soft lakebed sediments, and the social inequalities those hazards exacerbate. Wealthier neighborhoods may invest in mitigation, while poorer districts face recurrent damages. The city's ancient water management systems, once ingeniously adapted to lacustrine life, are now the substrate of contemporary vulnerability. Yet archaeological work also reshapes urban imagination in constructive ways. Public access to the Templo Mayor site and museum creates opportunities for education, for indigenous communities to reclaim and reinterpret heritage, and for citizens to confront the layered past honestly. New municipal and national initiatives increasingly frame the pre-Hispanic city as integral to Mexico's plural history, not a separate antique curiosity. That reframing matters. A metropolis that recognizes its buried origins can make different choices about preservation, commemoration, and urban design. There are human stories among the stones. Market sellers whose waste filled centuries of deposits. Priests who oversaw ritual enlargement of the pyramid. Children whose remains were ritually interred. Traces of lives that ordinary history might miss. Excavation recovers voices that were never written in colonial chronicles. Local artisans, provincial tribute bearers, and women petitioning local deities for blessings. In the artifacts and ecofacts, we read diets, trade routes, and power relations. In those details, we meet the lived texture of Tenochtitlan's urban life. Finally, the ghost of Tenochtitlan teaches a broader truth about cities, that city life is a dialogue across centuries between environment, technology, politics, and ritual. A capital built on reeds and canals became a colonial metropolis of stone, which in turn became a modern megacity struggling with water, subsidence, and identity. Each layer carries forward the decisions of the prior ones. The choices of rulers and engineers centuries ago shape present-day realities. To walk the Zócalo is to walk a junction in time, to stand where people of profoundly different worlds organized their lives, worshiped their gods, and negotiated power. Beneath the plaza's paving stones, beneath the cathedral's foundations, the Templo Mayor sleeps and waits to be read, not as myth, but as a densely evidenced archive of empire, ritual, and urban adaptation. The ghosts we find there are not supernatural, but material, pottery, stone, bone, and through them, archaeology restores human complexity to a place that colonial maps once flattened. In that recovery, the city's dead teach the living how cities endure, transform, and remember.
Some cities refuse to vanish. They survive not because they are static monuments, but because they are living organisms, constantly remade by new populations, new rulers, new religions, and shifting environments. Cairo and Damascus are two of those places, urban palimpsests whose very fabric records continuous reinvention. Their survival is a story of geography, governance, faith, and the stubborn human habit of rebuilding where life is possible. Cairo's story is braided with older settlements that predate its formal foundation. The Nile Valley held a succession of capitals, Memphis to the south, Heliopolis to the northeast, each layering monuments and cemeteries on the alluvial plain. With the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 17th year after Prophet Muhammad's death, Amr ibn al-As
founded Fustat in 641 CE as a military and administrative camp on the Nile's east bank. Fustat became the first major Arab urban presence in Egypt and established the model for later Islamic urban life. The Fatimids remade that landscape. In 969 to 973 CE, the Fatimid Caliph Al-Mu'iz established a new royal city, Al-Qahira, Cairo, originally conceived as a palace city and a caliphal capital to anchor Fatimid authority in Egypt. From that moment, Cairo grew around earlier centers, Fustat, nearby Abbasid palaces, and Coptic settlements. What we call Islamic Cairo is therefore not a single construction event, but the accretion of military camp, administration, palaces, markets, and religious complexes across centuries. That accretion explains a paradox of Cairo. It looks modern and medieval at once. Mamluk and Ottoman monuments, soaring madrasa facades, carved minarets, and sultans' tombs sit atop layers that include earlier Roman and pharaonic remains, and beneath them, the graveyards and foundations of even older settlements. Archaeologists reading the city's strata find pottery, house plans, and administrative deposits that tell of continuity in daily life and continual transformation in political order. Urban Cairo is a long-run negotiation between continuity and renewal. Damascus makes a similar claim to endurance, though through a different geography. Located on a fertile plateau with perennial springs and at crossroads of trade routes, Damascus functioned as an oasis hub for millennia. Many scholars now consider it among the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities. Evidence of settlement on and around the site reaches deep into the Bronze Age and Iron Age, and its importance rises and falls with empires: Aramaean, Assyrian, Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, and Umayyad, yet its urban core never quite emptied. The Umayyad period made Damascus a capital of extraordinary symbolic weight. When the Umayyad Caliph placed its court there in the 7th and early 8th centuries, the Great Mosque of Damascus, rebuilt and expanded under Caliph al-Walid I between about 705 and 715 CE, became a monumental expression of the city's political and religious centrality. Yet even that monumental phase rests upon earlier urban layers. Roman colonnaded avenues, Hellenistic chambers, and Aramaean neighborhoods were reworked into an Islamic capital rather than entirely erased. Why do these cities persist? Geography explains much. Cairo sits along the Nile's fertile corridor with trade access to the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. Damascus occupies a strategic gap between Mesopotamia and the Levant, with fertile hinterlands and secure water. Those advantages persist even as political boundaries shift, making both places perennial centers of production, exchange, and administration. People, farmers, merchants, builders, continued to invest labor in these sites because the basic conditions for life and commerce remained favorable. But persistence also requires cultural and institutional flexibility. In both cities, new rulers often repurposed rather than obliterate the urban fabric. Mosques reused Roman columns, palaces sprang from the bones of earlier palatial compounds, markets shifted but stayed near the same crossroads. This pragmatic reuse, spolia, adaptive planning, and incremental remodeling allowed daily life to continue even through regime change. The city's memory was layered into its stones, and those stones served practical needs as much as symbolic ones. Consider the material evidence beneath Cairo's busy streets. When construction or conservation projects reveal older layers, archaeologists find everything from Roman-era pottery to Fatimid palace foundations. Islamic Cairo's dense Medina districts preserve Mamluk-era urban forms,
narrow lanes funneling into open markets, caravanserai structures for merchants, and richly endowed religious foundations. These features reflect centuries of civic investment and charitable endowments that structured social life and anchored neighborhoods across generations.
In Damascus, archaeology and architectural study show how Roman and Byzantine urbanism underwrote later urban forms. The city's Roman grid and colonnaded streets influenced Muslim-era urban layouts. The Umayyads incorporated and transformed Roman structures into Islamic civic institutions. The Great Mosque itself contains reused elements and sits in an area whose urban function evolved rather than disappeared. That continuity of place, not necessarily of regime or religion, made Damascus a recurrent seat of power. Continuity is never seamless. Both cities endured episodes of destruction, conquest, fire, earthquake that reset parts of the urban fabric. Fustat, for example, suffered a famous burning in the 9th century during political turmoil. Parts were deliberately destroyed, abandoned, and later remade as Cairo expanded. Yet even those episodes became part of the strata. Burned layers preserved material traces, charred beams, ash lenses, collapsed walls that archaeologists used to time events and to understand how inhabitants coped with crisis. Destruction can be a kind of preservation if the debris seals a moment in time. Another important force is religion and ritual. Both cities have sacred geographies that shape continuity. Churches, mosques, and shrines anchor neighborhoods, and the endowments attached to them, waqfs in the Islamic context, often preserve institutional stability across centuries. Endowments paid for maintenance, charity, and urban services, creating an economic engine that could outlast dynasties. That web of religiously motivated institutions is part of why certain quarters remained inhabited and cared for through long stretches of change. Modernity introduces new stresses and new discoveries. When modern infrastructure is built, roads, subways, sewer systems, it often cuts through earlier layers and exposes the buried city. In Athens and Rome, we saw metro excavations. In Cairo and Damascus, conservation and rescue archaeology have revealed Roman baths, medieval foundations, and earlier occupation strata. These interventions open public access to the past, but also create dilemmas. Which layers to preserve in place, which to record and remove, and how to integrate ancient finds into a living urban fabric. Political events complicate heritage conservation. Both Cairo and Damascus have experienced conflicts and regime changes that affected preservation priorities, funding, and access. Damage to monuments and disruptions to archaeological programs are tragic not only for the material loss, but for the interruption of the scholarly conversation that helps societies understand themselves through time. International cooperation, when possible, has helped stabilize key sites. When it has not, damage to the archaeological record can be irreversible. Yet even amid disruption, local communities often keep memory alive. In Cairo's Old City, families pass down knowledge of neighborhood histories, oral traditions of founding saints, and rituals tied to specific mosques or markets. In Damascus, streets evoke long-standing trades, metalworkers, textile dyers, bakers, that connect present livelihoods to centuries of craft knowledge. Those living practices become informal conservators of continuity. They are the social threads that stitch together layers of stone, wood, and earth. The archaeology itself is disciplined work. Stratigraphy, material culture analysis, and historical cross-referencing produce a chronology that is testable and revisable. Excavations in Cairo record Fatimid palace pavements, Mamluk foundations, and Ottoman renovations in sequence. In Damascus, careful study of building phases can separate Roman, Byzantine, and early Islamic construction. This layered evidence resists simple narratives of decline or uninterrupted glory.
Instead, it shows urban life as a sequence of responses to changing political economies and environmental conditions. There are also broader lessons about urban resilience. Building on previous foundations is sometimes an act of prudence, reusing infrastructure, following old road lines, and maintaining waterworks. But it can also be a liability. Older infrastructure may not suit new needs, and dense urban fabrics complicate disaster response. The challenge for modern planners is to negotiate heritage protection and contemporary needs, maintaining the living city while respecting the layers that made it possible. Human stories animate these layers. In Cairo, the charitable foundations of a Mamluk sultan might fund a fountain where local children play centuries later. In Damascus, a Roman column reused in a mosque bears silent witness to generations of worshippers. The archaeological fragments, pottery sherds, coin hoards, foundation trenches, are not just data points. They are traces of meals eaten, contracts signed, prayers offered, and markets transacted. Reading them lets us recover the textures of ordinary life across millennia. Both cities also show the political uses of the past. Rulers have often invoked ancient capital status, urban antiquity, or monumental continuity to legitimize power. That's visible in Fatimid Cairo's palatial symbolism, or in Umayyad Damascus' monumental mosque program. At the same time, ordinary people and later national movements reclaim layers of the past for identity politics and cultural revival. The past becomes a resource for the present, sometimes responsibly, sometimes instrumentally. As we walk their streets then, treat Cairo and Damascus not as fossilized museums, but as palimpsests, living pages written and rewritten by countless hands. Their endurance is not miraculous, it is structural, a consequence of favorable geography, adaptive institutions, and human decisions to reuse, repair, and reinvent. Their ruins are not only monuments to glory, but archives of ordinary life. Ultimately, these cities teach us a simple lesson about urban time. Continuity depends on capacity to adapt. When neighborhoods can adjust uses, when institutions provide stability across dynastic change, and when people continue to invest in the built environment, cities persist. Cairo and Damascus are testimonies to that capacity. Cities that, through millennia of rule and ruination, never quite died but kept being remade. In their stones, we read a long human conversation about survival, faith, and the habits that bind us to particular places. If you want to see these layers with your own eyes, visit museums and preserved sites and support responsible heritage projects, and read the archaeological reports that make these histories rigorous. The streets are full of stories. They only ask that we slow down, look beneath the surface, and listen.
In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a surprising alliance formed between two very different industries, the bulldozer and the trowel. As cities grew and infrastructure projects dove deeper, subways, sewer upgrades, high-speed rail tunnels, they began to cut through the literal layers of human occupation. What construction exposed, archaeologists seized. Entire neighborhoods of the past, preserved under asphalt and Victorian fill. This modern rediscovery is not a single event, but a global phenomenon that has reshaped both urban life and the science of archaeology. Urban archaeology is a specialized practice because cities bury their past in complicated ways. Long-term habitation produces dense stratigraphy, thin, interleaved layers of occupation that include floors, wells, trash pits, and foundations. Unlike open field excavations, city digs must work around modern utilities and living neighborhoods. They often require rapid, highly documented rescue work to record remains before construction proceeds. The careful balance between preservation and development is the modern archaeologist's daily negotiation. Some of the largest windows into buried cities have come through metro and rail projects.
The Athens metro program of the 1990s turned construction sites into archaeologies of urban life, discovering tens of thousands of artifacts and entire profiles of domestic and ritual spaces that stretched from the Bronze Age through classical, Roman, and Byzantine layers. Planners and archaeologists worked together. Stations were redesigned to display finds in situ, turning transport hubs into public portals to the past. The Athens example popularized the idea that infrastructure can become a cultural opportunity rather than only a threat. In London, the Crossrail project, Europe's largest urban engineering program in recent decades, became Britain's largest single archaeological campaign. Tens of thousands of objects, human remains, and building remains spanning millennia were recorded as tunneling passed beneath the city. Finds ranged from Mesolithic flint tools and Roman burials to Tudor-era artifacts and industrial-age dockworks. Crossrail demonstrated how a single transport corridor can provide a sweeping cross-section of a city's deep history while forcing new protocols for industrial-scale archaeology. These large projects forced a cultural shift. Where 19th-century antiquarians had collected and prized spectacular monuments and statuary, modern urban archaeology emphasizes context. The exact position of a sherd, the layering of deposits, the relationship between a hearth and a rubbish pit. Innovators like Flinders Petrie and other early methodologists laid the groundwork for stratigraphic rigor, but the scale and speed of contemporary urban work required new institutional frameworks, legislation, developer-funded archaeology, and interdisciplinary teams that include engineers, conservators, and community liaisons. Policy frameworks followed practice. International organizations and national agencies promoted guidelines for integrating heritage into urban development. UNESCO's Historic Urban Landscape approach, for example, urges planners to manage historic areas holistically, linking conservation with economic and social policy rather than isolating monuments from the life of the city. In practice, that means designing projects to preserve in situ where possible, or to document and conserve finds when preservation on site is impossible. The idea is to make heritage part of a living city's future, not a museumized fossil. Yet the practicalities are messy. Construction timetables, budgets, and political priorities often press against the slow rhythm of archaeology. Rescue or development-led archaeology has emerged as a compromise. Developers fund archaeological recording and mitigation before work proceeds. This model has produced remarkable results, but also ethical dilemmas. When is removal justified? Who decides what is significant? And how do we ensure that documentation is thorough rather than cursory? These questions animate debates among planners, archaeologists, and local communities. The public dimension is central. When archaeological finds appear in a subway station, a market redevelopment, or a civic plaza, they enter everyday life. Athens' decision to integrate displays into metro stations turned commuters into museum-goers. London's Crossrail Learning Legacy published open data and exhibits to share discoveries with millions. Public archaeology, exhibits, outreach programs, and on-site interpretation helps translate complex stratigraphic data into narratives that resonate with citizens. That transparency builds political will to save heritage and educates people about how their cities were made.
Technology has multiplied what we can learn. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, GIS mapping, and high-resolution photogrammetry allow archaeologists to survey without intrusive digging. In underwater contexts, side-scan sonar and sub-bottom profilers map submerged structures before divers intervene. Digital recording, three-dimensional models of mosaics, laser scans of facades permits both precise analysis and public dissemination. These tools accelerate recording, an advantage when construction windows are short, and preserve a virtual archive when in situ conservation is impossible. The rediscovery process also revises historical narratives. A trench can overturn a century-old assumption about a city's layout or date a street to a century earlier than previously thought. Cross-system projects have rewritten local histories. London's Crossrail found Mesolithic evidence and new Roman burials. Athens recontextualized neighborhoods as multi-period palimpsests. Thessaloniki's new metro, completed after long delays and debt-era pauses, has recently revealed Byzantine and Roman markets that reframed public understanding of the city's long occupation. Each discovery invites historians to update the storybook that communities tell about themselves. There are difficult ethical questions beneath the excitement. Urban digs commonly reveal human remains. Handling those finds demands legal, scientific, and cultural sensitivity. Some remains require reburial according to religious or descendant community wishes. Others demand scientific study to understand health, diet, and demography. Museums and archaeological agencies now routinely consult descendant communities, faith groups, and civic stakeholders to establish protocols. That consultative ethic is recent but crucial. The past is not merely data, it is also the ancestry and memory of living peoples. The economics matter too. Developer-funded archaeology produces data, but also raises questions about access and ownership. Artifacts recovered during construction are often curated by national museums, but the cost of conservation, publication, and long-term storage is significant. Some projects have funneled resources into public education and local museums. Others have produced archives that sit unpublished in storage. Balancing budgets, scholarly priorities, and public benefit remains an ongoing challenge for heritage managers. Climate change and urban risk add a new layer to the modern rediscovery. Rising water tables, coastal erosion, and more severe weather threaten both exposed and buried heritage. In some cases, archaeologists intentionally excavate sites before they are lost to sea level rise or flood-driven erosion. In others, conservation strategies must adapt to changing environmental baselines. Urban planners must now factor heritage vulnerability into climate resilience plans, not only to protect monuments, but because heritage often sits at the same low-lying desirable riverfronts and harbors that cities value for transport and tourism. The human stories that emerge from rescue digs are often intimate and democratic. Where palaces and temples give the broad outline of power, a rubbish pit yields diet, a clay token shows trade connections, and a child's toy reveals domestic life. Large infrastructure projects therefore democratize the archaeological record. Instead of a few spectacular monuments, we encounter ordinary lives at scale, from medieval market vendors to industrial-age laborers. That shift changes public relations with the past. Heritage is seen less as an elite inheritance and more as a shared civic archive. International collaboration has become a standard feature of large urban digs. Cross-border teams bring expertise in conservation, underwater excavation, and material science. The discoveries in places like Alexandria's submerged royal quarter relied on multinational partnerships, as have many large rail-related excavations in Europe. These collaborations can transfer technology and training to local institutions, strengthening heritage management capacities long after construction ends. But they also require careful negotiation over who leads, who interprets, and how finds are displayed. Modern rediscovery reframes responsibility. If cities are palimpsests, then current urban choices write tomorrow's strata. The ways we build, materials we use, groundwater we pump, neighborhoods we demolish shape what future archaeologists will find. Integrating heritage into planning is not nostalgia. It is recognition that the past is materially entangled with the present. Good urban design can preserve historical character while accommodating growth. Poor planning can irreversibly erase evidence that could have taught us about resilience, inequality, and innovation across centuries. In short, the modern rediscovery of buried cities is both scientific revolution and civic project. It forces us to slow down and to think of infrastructure not just as pipes and tracks, but as an opportunity to listen to the ground. Museums, metro stations, and public plazas now serve as interfaces between commuters and archaeologists, developers and curators, past and present. That conversation is still new, still imperfect, but it has already returned to public life a richer, more complex image of the cities we inhabit. If this makes you curious, visit your local urban archaeology displays, read project reports, and support policies that require careful documentation before development. Cities will keep growing, and with them the chance to discover what lies beneath, if we design projects that respect both the needs of the living and the voices of the buried past.
The ground beneath a city is a storyteller that speaks in fragments, shards of pottery, charred seeds, a buried hearth, or a coin lost in traffic 1,000 years ago. Those fragments are not random debris, they are durable sentences in an immense, slow script. Archaeologists call this script stratigraphy, the stacked sequence of deposits that record human choices, disasters, and daily routines. Read correctly, those layers let us hear what the earth remembers. Material memory operates at many scales. A single thin lens of ash can mark a volcanic event and be precisely dated. A midden, an accumulated rubbish pit, can reveal diet, trade links, and even social inequality through the presence or absence of prestige foods. Pollen trapped in ancient floors tells us whether a neighborhood was once an orchard or a marketplace. Isotopes preserved in human teeth revealed childhood diets and migration patterns. The earth preserves mundane details that written sources often omit, and in those details we recover voices that never made it into chronicles. The archaeological palimpsest is not only about proud monuments, it is the sum of ordinary lives. When rescue excavations peel back a road surface, they commonly find traces of ordinary households, storage jars, loom weights, animal bones from meals, and children's toys. Those traces map the rhythms of work and family life across centuries and make clear that urban history is as much about labor and leisure as it is about kings and cathedrals. Natural catastrophes leave legible marks. The ash and pyroclastic deposits from Vesuvius in 79 CE preserved Pompeii and Herculaneum in astonishing detail. Frescoes, organic remains, and even the forms of bodies frozen in time, giving scholars a moment of rupture that illuminates everyday Roman life with an almost surgical clarity. Recent work, however, complicates the simple snapshot story. New excavations show reoccupation and adaptation after the eruption, reminding us that archaeological testimony often contains chapters of both sudden catastrophe and long human resilience. Human violence and policy also imprint the soil. Siege works, mass burials, and scorched horizons register wars and deliberate destruction. Conquest can also inscribe itself through reuse. Conquerors tore down temples, reused their masonry, or paved over shrines to assert new authority. In many cases, the conqueror's act of erasure preserved the very elements later archaeologists would unearth, fragments embedded in later foundations that become keys to earlier worlds. Urban expansions and infrastructure projects are modern accelerants of rediscovery. Train tunnels and metro stations routinely cut long trenches through buried sequences, exposing uninterrupted cross-sections of urban life from prehistory to modernity. Those cross-sections allow archaeologists to reconstruct changes in street orientation, neighborhood functions, and economic focus across centuries. In effect, giving us a vertical map of a city's biography. The earth remembers not only what people consumed, but where they came from. Chemical analysis of bone and tooth enamel, strontium and oxygen isotopes can indicate a person raised in a different geological region. When an assemblage shows diverse isotopic signatures, it speaks to migration, trade, and the cosmopolitan character of ancient cities.
Those scientific fingerprints let us see movement patterns that no tax register recorded. Trade routes, too, leave material trails. A shard of Mediterranean amphora found in a northern inland city is a breadcrumb of connection. Lapis lazuli, streaked into Mesopotamian jewelry, points toward Afghan highlands. These imported materials show the geographic reach of urban economies and the relative wealth of neighborhoods. When we assemble such finds across a city, we can sketch its economic geography. Which quarters were wealthy, which were industrial, and which were nodes of exchange. The earth also preserves intangible processes, hygiene, disease, and diet, through hard data. Sewage deposits and latrine fills contain parasite eggs and DNA traces that reveal sanitation standards and prevalent illnesses. Stable isotope studies of human remains build dietary profiles over lifetimes. Dental decay frequencies and bone chemistry hint at carbohydrate-heavy diets versus protein-rich ones. In this way, archaeological science complements medical history with direct biological evidence. Archaeological science has grown sophisticated, but context remains king. An isolated object tells only part of the tale. Its significance arises from where it sits in a layer and what surrounds it. That is why rescue archaeology emphasizes rigorous recording, exact coordinates, layer descriptions, and photographic sequences. Without context, an object becomes a curiosity rather than a data point in a coherent narrative. Modern three-dimensional recording and GIS mapping have turned excavated sites into digital palimpsests that researchers can interrogate for generations.
Some sites teach us how memory is politically managed. Jerusalem's dense layers, Bronze Age walls, Herodian plans, Byzantine churches, and Ottoman repairs show how successive rulers redefined sacred landscape and public space. Excavations at the City of David and the Western Wall tunnels reveal infrastructure and public architecture that undergird later claims to urban centrality. These layers are contested not only academically, but politically. Their interpretation factors into modern identity and territorial claims, reminding us archaeology can become part of contemporary debates as much as a tool for historical understanding. The palimpsest is also ecological testimony. Pollen, seeds, and faunal remains give us past environments and dietary landscapes. Where pollen analyses indicate olive orchards or cereal agriculture, we can infer the provisioning strategies of a city. Where mollusk shells dominate deposits, proximity to estuaries and maritime diets come into view. Urban layers thus record an ecological biography: how humans reshaped land, which species thrived, and when landscapes shifted. Urban burial practices reveal social structure and belief. Elite tombs, mass graves, and neighborhood cemeteries are spatial arguments about hierarchy and ritual. The placement of cemeteries relative to walls and roads, the presence of grave goods, and the variability in tomb architecture all signal differences in status, ethnicity, and religious practice. Mass burials from epidemic episodes or wartime events stand as tragic physical chapters in a city's memory, episodes the earth holds in its compacted soils. Importantly, the material record requires interpretive humility. Archaeologists build models and chronologies from samples, but these reconstructions are always provisional and subject to revision with new finds or better dating methods. Recent work on Pompeii, for example, has complicated the once simple narrative of a single-day catastrophe by showing evidence for reoccupation and reuse in later centuries, reminding us that sites thought frozen in time can have afterlives and layered biographies. The earth keeps surprising us, and every trench can revise a narrative once thought settled. The act of excavation itself is an ethical decision. Digging removes context even as it records it. Some archaeologists argue for minimal intervention when preservation in place is possible.
For vulnerable coastal or floodplain sites threatened by sea level rise, however, proactive excavation may be necessary to save data before it is lost. Those choices reflect values: which pasts we prioritize, which descendant communities we consult, and what we believe future generations should inherit. The earth remembers human voices that were never written down: the migrant basket maker, the baker whose oven left carbonized loaves, the worker who lost a bronze nail. Such traces democratize the archaeological record because they highlight daily life at scale. Large infrastructure projects, metro excavations, crossrail, highway redevelopments have amplified this democratization by revealing ordinary object-dense strata that formerly lay beneath inaccessible urban cores. Those discoveries reshape public histories to include the many rather than just the powerful. Memory and forgetting are both active processes. Governments and developers sometimes remove or obscure layers to build new visions of the city, just as earlier rulers repurposed monuments to assert authority. Conversely, grassroots movements and local historians can foreground neglected layers, alleyways, workshops, and vernacular architecture to reclaim heritage that official narratives marginalize. The urban earth thus becomes a political landscape, where choices about conservation reflect contested ideas about identity and value. Science and storytelling must work together. High-resolution dating, biomolecular analyses, and remote sensing give us chronology and context. Compelling narratives translate technical results into public understanding. Museums, in situ displays, and accessible publications bridge the expert and public spheres. When commuters see a Roman road inside a subway station, or a community visits a newly conserved marketplace, the city's multiple histories become civic resources rather than sterile archives. The earth also remembers errors and absences, the things that did not survive. Organic textiles, wooden structures, and perishable foods often vanish unless conditions favor preservation. That selective memory skews the archaeological record toward stone, ceramic, and metal. But scientific techniques like microfossil analysis, phytolith study, and ancient DNA help reconstruct these missing elements, allowing us to infer the textures of cloth, food, and human biology that were once invisible to excavation. In many ways, the question of what the earth remembers is also a question of responsibility. Buildings we erect, drainage systems we alter, and groundwater we extract will shape how future archaeologists read our present. Good urban planning that respects heritage does not freeze a city in amber. It acknowledges that our actions become part of a stratified story. Thoughtful integration of conservation, documentation, and community engagement allows the earth to keep telling its story honestly, for those willing to listen. The echoes beneath us are invitations. They invite us to slow down in a hurry-filled city, to step past a tourist plaque and imagine the lives contained in the ground beneath our feet. They invite us to support careful archaeology, to demand thoughtful development, and to recognize that the most ordinary pavement may be an archive waiting to be read. The earth remembers. Our task is to hear without imposing tidy morals, to read without hubris, and to steward these memories for the people yet to come.
Cities are not mere collections of buildings. They are long conversations between people across generations. Underneath asphalt and glass, the accumulated choices of farmers, rulers, artisans, and ordinary families form a continuous material thread. That thread binds past to present not as a relic show window, but as a living continuum. Foundations that steady new structures, road lines that guide modern traffic, and stories that shape communal identity. To understand a city is to read that conversation in its layered textures. The archaeological record offers more than antiquarian curiosity.
it gives us practical lessons. Ancient waterworks remind modern engineers about flood control and hydraulic logic. Reuse of materials teaches sustainable practices. Neighborhood patterns reveal durable social arrangements that persist through political upheaval. In many places, the physical landscape still channels markets, pilgrimage routes, and civic rituals that began centuries or millennia ago. The past, in other words, continues to shape how cities breathe, move, and govern themselves. Memory in the ground is also ethical. What we choose to preserve, to expose, or to erase reflects values about whose past matters. Conservation decisions are therefore moral as well as technical. Protecting a mosaic, stabilizing a temple, or leaving a foundation in place are choices that affirm certain narratives and silence others. Acknowledging that responsibility invites more inclusive stewardship, curatorial practices that incorporate local voices, descendant communities, and the broad public rather than privileging only the spectacular or the politically useful. There is humility in the strata. Archaeology routinely revises confident stories. A new trench can change chronologies, and refined dating can reconceive long-accepted sequences. This provisional nature is a strength, not a weakness. It is an honest recognition that human history is complex and that our interpretations must remain open to revision as new evidence appears. Cities reward patience and curiosity. The ground reveals itself slowly, and the best scholarship listens as much as it asserts. The continuity of urban life also reminds us that our present actions will be tomorrow's layers. Urban planning, infrastructure choices, and environmental management are contributions to a palimpsest that future generations will read. Responsible development, one that balances growth with heritage, that invests in resilience against subsidence and sea level rise, and that documents discoveries with care, can leave a richer, more legible record for those who come after us. There is a human consolation in this continuity. The same streets where commuters hurry, the same plazas where protests gather, and the same markets where children sell sweets are places where countless predecessors lived, worked, loved, and buried their dead. Material remains, shards, mosaics, foundations, are not cold artifacts, but traces of human time. They remind us that the extraordinary endurance of cities is rooted in countless ordinary lives, and that in walking our modern streets, we are always in touch with those who built them before us.